Thank you very much, and wonderful to be here, particularly to have people in the front row taking notes. So I feel a little bit like those pictures of Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Hopefully you'll find it as useful as they find the great leader's words. I want to start by just talking about what we mean by integration. Because it feels to me like there are two, one slightly negative and one slightly more positive views about what we actually mean by integration. So I start with David Cameron. And David Cameron in 2010 talked about broken Britain. So it feels to me that we're kind of, if we're talking about broken Britain, we're going to have to stick on alliteration. And broken Britain seems to me a political slogan, but not necessarily a factually true definition of the kind of Britain that we live in today. But Britain is diverse, and it seems to me that Britain is divided. So at least he was right on the idea that we should have alliteration, but he was wrong in the idea of exactly what type of country we're living in today. And I think we've got to bottom out exactly what we mean by integration. And I would entirely agree with what Omar said and implied, which is that it's about mixing, the idea of social mixing, which gets a pretty bad press. It smacks of social engineering. It smacks of all the kind of pushing people to do things that they don't want to do. But actually that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, do you live in the same street as someone but never talk to them? We are talking about, do you work in the same place as someone, even if you live miles away? Do you go to school in the same place as someone, even if you live miles away? Do you interact with people properly, meaningfully, on a day-to-day basis? And I just want to do a little walk through the ward that I represent in the centre of Walthamstow. Because actually, this ward, about 13,000 people, it's got the fastest rising house prices in Britain, I think, certainly in London at the moment, and I don't know what that means for my chance of getting re-elected next time, but there we go. But actually people rub along okay. People get along fine. We have very few problems of the kind that Ted was talking about. And I'm going to start in the south of the ward, and I'm just going to pick three parts, not really at random, but just to give you an idea of how people who get on fine actually live reasonably separate lives. So we're going to start near Leabridge Road, which is on the boundary between Walthamstow and Leighton. Probably the most heavily, housing-wise anyway, the most heavily Asian area of my ward, and in our neck of the woods, Asian primarily means Pakistani heritage. Those people primarily send their children to Berkeley Primary School, which is 95% plus Pakistani heritage children. When they go to secondary school, the boys go to Norlington School, 80% plus Pakistani heritage, and the girls go to Walthamstow School for Girls, 50% plus Pakistani heritage. People who live there generally work in the borough. They live their entire lives, in many cases, in the borough, and they often work with other working class Asians. And I don't want you to get fixated on the ethnicity point, because I'm going to come on to the fact that I think we talk far too much about ethnicity in this debate and not enough about age sometimes, but definitely about class. So we move north and we move into Walthamstow Village, where those house prices are going up so much. Much whiter, much richer, and much younger. Completely different. 200 yards away could be a completely different part of the country. They send their kids to different primary schools. They generally send them to a Church of England school. The girls mix at secondary school in Walthamstow School for Girls, and the boys might mix, but probably won't, because of the fact that Norlington Boys' School is 80% plus Asian. Those people are well off, and they generally work out of the borough. They socialise out of the borough, and they work and socialise with other middle-class people like them. And then 100 yards away from the village is Attlee Terrace, named after one of the former MPs for Walthamstow, Clement Attlee. Very mixed ethnically, not mixed at all socially. No interaction at all with people in the village, to the point where I offered £1,000, not of my own money, but of the council's money, to the Walthamstow Village Residents Association to set up a joint gardening club with people in Attlee Terrace. And what became very clear was that nobody in the Village Residents Association, A, were from Atley Terrace, or B, had ever been there. And the concept of going there was alien. Now, these are, I don't mean to demean these people, these are fantastic people, who actually, most of them were fairly appalled by their initial reaction to the idea of going onto a council estate, but they weren't going there. And so, it seems to me, Trevor Phillips famously said that we're sleepwalking into segregation. And I think we to an extent that we are. And we're doing it when we walk to work, we're doing it when we walk to school, and we do it when we buy the milk on a morning. We're going to different shops, different schools, different workplaces, and to some extent we're living in different places. It's everyday segregation. But it's not just about ethnicity. In fact, I would say class is a bigger element than ethnicity. So let's take the example I used to for my sins work in the city. And I worked with a lot of Muslim lawyers. They were a man and woman, and most of them were women, were middle class. And because you were working in the city, you quite often got a taxi home, quite often early in the morning or late at night, and quite often your taxi driver was also Muslim. But the city lawyer, who was Muslim and may have been of Pakistani origin, and his Muslim taxi driver were bound by faith, but entirely divided by class. And it seemed to me, and I just take one example, just one faith, one ethnicity, it seems to me that they had much less in common between each other, despite a shared faith and potentially shared ethnicity, than they did with the other people of whatever faith or none who worked in the same law firm as them. So class trumped ethnicity. And I just suspect that for most people, the contents of your wallet matters more than the colour of your skin. And Sonia mentioned the Social Integration Commission, which my organisation acted as the secretariat for. We found that the biggest gap of social integration between any group, any class, any age group, any ethnicity, was between social classes A and E. So the highest social class and the lowest one, primarily unemployed people, was much bigger than the gap between any two ethnicities. So class trumped ethnicity. And segregation matters as we become more diverse. So in the next 10 years, the proportion of under 18s and over 60s will rise from 42 to 47%. We're becoming a more polarised society by age. By ethnicity, the non-white population was 12% 4 years ago, and it's predicted to be 38% by 2050. And by income and class, you don't have to be a Labour councillor to agree that the extremes of poverty and wealth have grown in the last 30 or 40 years, to the point where in Walthamstow, we've just had our first £1 million house in Walthamstow Village. So segregation happens everywhere. But diversity doesn't lead to integration. So another thing that we found was that the most proportionally segregated part of the country by age, by class, and by ethnicity was London. Equally, the most diverse part of the country, on all three levels, is London. So you have to choose to integrate. And every single individual has to choose to integrate. It's not a matter for one group or another. It's a matter for absolutely everybody. And government matters in this, because actually what you find, and certainly what I see in my community, is quite often no one chooses to segregate, but the fact that you devolve down individual decisions at the level of the individual means that you end up with a society that doesn't look like the society that anyone chooses. So to give you an example, if you may agree that it's just self-evidently obvious that every parent should be able to send their children to the school that they want, which is fine, and I probably agree with you. I wasn't going to mention it, but my firstborn's due tomorrow. So I will certainly be looking to send them to whichever school I want to. But doesn't that lead to segregation in schools? Isn't that the reason why you have mono-ethnic schools in a hyper-diverse part of London? Because you devolve the decision down to the individual level rather than the society level. And so I just want to finish with a couple of thoughts. First, I want to go back to David Cameron, because I do think it's a genuinely important political thing that has happened in the last year or so. David Cameron wrote the 2005 Conservative Manifesto, which I would say was a pretty obvious dog whistle to some of the baser things in society, the kind of Donald Trump elements of British society. With that phrase, are you thinking what we're thinking? Now, thankfully, it turned out that fewer people were thinking that than he thought. But this is the same man who this year is talking about everyone being able to play a part in British society, regardless of your faith or background. That is a genuine big thing for that political party, with the background of that party, to be talking in the way it is. But equally, it matters when the left, which I'm part of, talks in ways which suggest that we value the differences between people to be much more important than the things that bring us together and the similarities between people. And it seems to me that quite often the left falls into that trap of valuing difference rather than similarity. And that really is a problem. But government matters. You only have to look to the Labour Party in places like Rotherham, which thought that you could offshore anything that happened within a certain community to the elders, quite often self-appointed elders, of that community, rather than actually dealing with it on the basis of universal values. Government matters, and the effects of decisions taken in local and national government matter for years. So I would say, just to summarise, I do think we do have to wake up from our sleepwalk into divided diversity, but I do think we shouldn't oversell that. There are a lot of positives. Omar and Ted have both talked about the way that young people particularly are changing their views of what it means to be British, what it means to be young in this country, whether they're British or not. One tiny example, we were doing a programme with Year 5 and 6 children, so the final 2 years of primary school. And this was a class, pretty normal class for Walthamstow, about half Pakistani heritage, a quarter white British heritage, and a quarter everything else. And one of the children was asked, if he had to name 3 things which he would see as being the central elements of his character, which he would go to if he didn't know whether something was right or wrong. And he named Allah, number 1, number 2, his mum, and number 3, Sergio Aguero of Manchester City. Now, you can ask yourself, why was this boy from Walthamstow supporting Manchester City and not West Ham or Spurs or Leyton Orient? Fair enough. But that seems to me that in that little anecdote, there's quite a lot of hope for this country. We have to choose integration, because as I said, if you don't choose integration, it will not happen. And the final thing I'd say is that while Britain may not be broken, I think that a lot of policy isn't intended to segregate people, but that is the effect of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mark, what happened with your gardening club?
My gardening club, I've still got the £1,000 if anyone wants to use it.
Oh, wow. Okay, it didn't get taken up. That's interesting.